All right, we're live and we are here with another Tit Talk. It's always a struggle to even say Tit Talk, especially with TikTok these days. But we are back, and today's topic we are discussing is destigmatizing cannabis in romance novels. I'm super excited about this one, and you better believe I 100% chose this to line up with 420 as best as I could. And so here we are to talk about cannabis use, cannabis representation, and characters who like to toke in romance novels. So I'm super excited to chat about it. And it's something that I feel like we're seeing a shift in. And that's something that I always want to bring attention to when it comes to romance novels is where are we coming from? What's going on now? And where are we heading? So I'm super excited to have this wonderful panel to chat with me. My name is Kelly Reynolds. I'm the host of Boobies and Noobies podcast. And I'm going to let each of my panelists introduce themselves. And I'm just going to kick it over to who's right next to me, and that is Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm an avid romance reader. I've been reading romance since I was 13 when my mom literally threw a book at me when I told her I was bored. And so I'm very excited to be part of this panel because having been reading romance since the mid 90s now to here, there's definitely seeing that trend and that shift to it. So
Awesome. And then how about over to Nicole?
Hello, my name is Nicole Falls. I write contemporary romance, and much like Jen, been reading it since I was a teenager. And this topic, I have a lot to say about it. Just because uh, I we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But I have definitely a lot to say about this.
Yeah, that's great. And honestly, I'm very excited by how responsive people have been. Thanks, Andy. I'm really excited about how people are really interested in having this discussion and talking about this. This seems like there's been a lot of people who just saw the post about it, whether it was on my page or anybody else on the panel's page. And yeah, I'm glad that we're not the only ones who want to talk about it. So over to Nellie.
Hey y'all, I'm Nellie Wilson. I write contemporary romance about elder millennials. And when I started writing romance, I was like, really pulling from my friends, and like we're all in our 30s, and I was like, it feels weird that I'm writing books taking place in Colorado and there's no mention of cannabis because as a millennial, it's like kind of just like in the I don't know the ether. An elder millennial, and so I think it's really important to like normalize and to kind of break down some stereotypes, but then also talk about the realities of like the inequities of cannabis in the world and how it shows up for characters of different identities, specifically around race. So it's something I definitely want to also talk about too.
Awesome. And last but very not least is Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia. I've been writing or publishing for 5 years. I have 30 something books out, and I didn't even know this was a thing I did until Kelly pointed out, but probably at least 20 of my books have. I write rock stars and college students, so it's just something that comes natural.
Yeah. I'm gonna assume I can't be the only one who's pointed it out to you, Julia. Like, I mean, I don't think I would be. Maybe. Yes. No. I don't know. Oh, you're on mute. I don't know if you were trying to add to that.
My yeah, my internet keeps breaking up, so I'm hearing like every 10 words. So if I look at you dumbly, I probably didn't hear you.
That's okay. All I was saying was that I would assume that I'm not the only person who's pointed out like the prevalence of your characters, smoking or using pot in your books. Like I can't be the only one who's noticed that, I would assume.
when I was looking for books with recommendations in them, Julia was one of the first books that showed up that people were like, you need to read these series. And so it's really cool that you're here, and it's just exciting to interact with you on that because you were definitely recommended to me because of this topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think last year Kelly made a post on Twitter and someone recommended one of my books and then someone replied, to be honest, I don't know any of Julia's books that it doesn't have. So
It's true. In
True.
fact, when I was, I'll start the conversation off with this. What I think is really interesting is every time that I put together one of these panels or, anytime I want to do a podcast episode, I always kind of want to see what's already out there on the subject. Like, what conversations are we already having about this? And I was shocked by the complete lack of blog posts, podcast episodes, really just honestly chat about it on Twitter, which is usually my go-to spot for stuff like this, revolving around this topic. Like I did searches for romance novels and cannabis, romance novels, weed, romance novels, pot. Like, I mean, it was amazing to me how few posts there were, and 3 of them were mine on Twitter. And so it really is incredible to me that this isn't really a conversation that's being had by a ton of people, at least not on public forums. So all the more reason that we should talk about it now. But yes, I did do a post, and I will for sure bring up some of the books that were recommended. But if anybody does want to see the full list, I do have a list of 420 friendly book recommendations for romance that lives on my Twitter. So I'll be happy to share that with anybody. But let's go ahead and kick things off. And I know a few of you mentioned this already in your introductions, that you've also noticed this shift, this trend. I don't even want to call it a trend, this shift about how we're including cannabis use in romance novels now versus maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I'd love to, for each of you, like thinking back on the romance novels that you've both read and also written, can you remember when you first read about cannabis use in romance novels and what that portrayal looked like? And it looks like we have Julia in and out, so hopefully we'll get her back in here in a second. And that's honestly open question. Kick it over to anybody who wants to answer.
So I revisited some older books, and we have to talk about Miss Nora here, Public Secrets, which was published in the 90s, and it does feature cannabis a lot in the book. But the cannabis use is now the main character's father is, a rock star, a musician. So it's kind of in that realm, but also like it's very much associated with like the abusive mother character and things like that. So there's definitely like this negative association. So this was the earliest I could find in my like kind of research. And it was such an interesting, like it was either in that rock star space or in that association as a negative association.
Yeah, we'll go more into that as well. But Nellie, it looks like you wanted to add something.
Yeah. So I was like a closet romance reader because I thought like you had to be smart and read like boring books that made you sad. And then COVID hit, and I was like, nah, I need happiness. And I like fully came out as a romance reader. It's also when I started talking publicly about my cannabis use, conveniently. And I remember seeing it a lot through a lot of Own Voices rep of chronic pain. And so specifically, I think it's the second Bergman Brothers book by Chloe Leese has a character who uses it to self-medicate around rheumatoid arthritis, I believe she has. And so I was seeing it a lot in like the medical cannabis, and I was like, that's awesome. That's a really important rep too. But like, what about people who just like getting high? Because I think we've normalized like bars are a common location. We talk about like alcohol in books was normed, and I wasn't seeing that. And I really still don't see a lot of just characters like kicking back and smoking a joint. And I think that's still what's interesting to me is that's lacking. But I see more chronic pain use, but I also see a lot of like, oh, I used to do it and now I don't. Of like that's the character arc of growth. It's like they've like weaned themselves off cannabis, and that's another interesting dynamic as well. That this is something that is you like break away from. So.
Yeah, especially when it relates to like the character's backstory and like how they've grown, like they've grown away from cannabis.
Yeah. I mean, like, and that feels well, not me.
It was just a phase in their lives, right? Like that's how it always is. It was a phase. Oh yeah, I smoked a joint or two when I was in college. For me, I cannot recall the earliest that I've seen the mention of cannabis in a romance novel. Just because not the best memory. However, I can say that I read mostly indie. And I read a fair share of urban romance written by indie authors as well. And there, it's nothing for somebody to spark up a J, or there's a blunt in rotation, like something like that. But as far as like on just like the indie Black romance side, I don't see a lot of mentions of cannabis just casually. And I think it's sort of linked to something that Nellie had said earlier about some of the, stigmatizations and how things are looked at or enforced upon people who look differently. I think that in that space, like respectability politics and things like that sort of come out. And so I think that's another reason why we are not seeing it as much in um, like straight up contemporary romance, just because, there's still that whole full morality, oh, clutching our pearls because somebody said that they smoke a little weed. Like, this is not that serious. Like, it's just not, it's never that serious. But I think, that has to factor into why we're slowly but surely starting to see more people talk about it.
It's interesting you say that because I think about to what Julia said when she introduced herself about like, oh, I write rock star, so it's there, and it's like there are certain character archetypes that like, oh, rock stars smoke, like you've got like the burnout brother or whatever, but like, man, like what about our functional stoners out there? Like that is also a thing that exists, and I think that's where I really want to see it start to happen. We're like, oh no, like instead of just having like a glass of whiskey when you get home, like you said, you just like smoke a joint and then you go to sleep because that's the
And
best
I
thing.
don't think it's limited to character archetypes either, that it's also, I think we see it represented very differently when it comes to men versus women. Think we see it represented very differently when it comes to different races of our characters, different socioeconomic backgrounds of our characters. So we will for sure dive into that. But Julia, I wanted to give you a chance to also add to it if you wanted to. If you can hear me. That's okay.
I can't. I'm trying.
You are doing wonderfully. You're fine. All I was asking was if you wanted to, Julia, add to the conversation about if you remember reading any romances. Like, I mean, obviously you include cannabis in a lot of your books, but before you started writing, did you read some?
It wasn't anything I ever noticed. Like, I mean, I didn't notice I was doing it. So, yeah, I can't really, like Nicole said, I have no memory. So I don't remember the last book I read, much less years ago. And since it's been brought to my attention, I have taken notice. But honestly, so like heavy drinking, I'm like another glass of wine. Like that's very common in the books that I've read like 10 years ago. But I don't feel like cannabis use was or yeah.
Yeah, no, and honestly, I see a wonderful question in the comments, and I will get to that, I promise. But since you brought up alcohol, Julia, I did kind of want to lean into that a little bit more too, because I think one of the things that always surprises me and ticks me off, honestly, is that when I'm reading romance, alcohol is very common to read about. I mean, we read about characters who own breweries and wineries, and we read about characters who go out with their friends. And I know we've definitely read potentially squicky scenes where maybe somebody gets a little too drunk and things happen after that as well. And in 2023, when 27 states in the United States, plus the District of Columbia, have decriminalized marijuana and 22 states have legalized it, I'm just wondering why we're not talking about it more in our books, at least to the same degree that we do when it comes to alcohol.
I think this topic, and I started to see it more the first time I saw it, and it happened in a trade published book where a character used it in a casual setting in place of an alcohol relaxation, and it was not a medicinal use situation. Was in Thank You Next by Andy J. Christopher, and it's a second chance romance. And literally, it was just the character took a gummy and they went on this road trip to confront her other ex-boyfriend to see why they got married after they dumped her and this whole thing. And I had to put the book down, and I was like, I think that's the first time I've ever seen a character just use cannabis in place of alcohol and things like that. And it was such an interesting, it was a little shocking to me, honestly. And I don't know why I was shocked by it, but it made me sit down and think of how many other times have we seen this in books. I was like, I don't really see it that much. And that book was just published last year or the year before. So it was very new and very recent. So
my day job is I'm a historian, and there's also a strong history in the US specifically about the demonization of weed as it's associated to things the government wants to put down, specifically associated with jazz and black culture. Reefer Madness is my favorite thing to watch high. So the original. But so I think and Nicole talked earlier about respectability politics, and I think there's also this push to get romance taken seriously as a genre, in this kind of resurgence. And so I'm wondering if that crosses the lines there of oh, we want to be mainstream people. But I also think it's interesting because for the last 12 years of my life, I've lived in states where it's legal. And I think, we have a lot of people who make up fictional towns in states where it's legal as they live there. And so I think that idea of just maybe not experiencing it. So in California, I mean, I pass more dispensaries than liquor stores sometimes. Colorado was the same way. Someone asked me what it was like when Colorado legalized cannabis. And I was like, you think it was hard to get a joint before? It's Colorado.
Oregon and Washington are also very similar.
Right. And these are the places that, and I'm speaking as a white author who predominantly writes white characters. It's in that world where that's normed in these little cute towns everyone wants to set their books in, but I don't know if necessarily that lived experience matches. And I think there's still a stigma of being viewed as a stoner writer. Oh, she's just the one who writes books about weed, rather than just but like you said earlier, no one's oh, she's the one who writes books about alcohol. That's just in romance. And I also think there's interesting if you write characters who are sober, how that also becomes a banner. And it's well, these are all just different lived experiences that coexist, in my experience of being a 30-something in the world.
That's interesting. And what's funny is I hadn't really thought about the small town setting versus, and I think it's because I actually love to read a more urban setting, in my books. And it's something that I've talked about before on a previous Tit Talk is, why are there so many small town romances? Why aren't people falling in love in big cities? Because that, I think, is just a lived experience of so many people as well. But I hadn't really necessarily thought about the idea that it's definitely more normalized when it is in the big city versus in a small town, both in our media as well as in real life. Although I can't tell you how many people I know who grew up in small towns that were getting high in the parking lot of CVS for their entire high school experience.
We didn't have a CVS. My town was so small. There was it was called, it was a local drugstore, Buzz's drugstore.
Buzz.
And it was the gas
Perfect
station.
name.
Thank you.
I know.
And my thing is also small towns, and this is just another rant of mine, is I grew up in a small town. It sucked. It wasn't cool. It was problematic and purity culture. And now there's intergenerational poverty. I'm from Appalachia, y'all. It's not cute and quaint. And there's no old lady giving me wise wisdom. She's giving me moonshine. And I think it's also this idea of in the best way, writing outside your lived experience. And that could be part of it too.
I love a small town romance because I was it's such an idealized version of how I grew up. So I don't know. Kate Claiborne, in her most recent book, Georgie All Along, had marijuana use. It was set in a small town in Virginia, but it was more in that medical field, which is now marijuana is legal in Virginia, but only in a medical way. They're moving towards recreational. So I thought that was, again, a small town featuring medical marijuana use. So
It is
Yeah.
interesting how it seems like, and how it seems like there are a lot of books that when they do incorporate any kind of marijuana use, it's done so in a medicinal way, which I mean, I do think should be represented. Like, I'm not saying that shouldn't be there, but that it almost feels like this is the only way that we can get away with this and have it be, um shall we say, morally acceptable. Like, but I mean, that just brings into a whole question of like what's morally acceptable, so I
I
don't know,
wouldn't
it
say
seems.
morally acceptable as much as maybe palatable, right? Because
Yeah,
if it's seen as some sort of, last resort way for someone to be cared for, then it's like, oh, okay, sure, right? Like
yeah,
in that case, and oh, I understand, right? Like there's nothing else they could do, and she's in so much pain, so of course someone's baking her edible, So it makes it, I don't even, like palatable is the only words I'm really like getting from that, because if there is a cause and effect, right? Not just somebody just smoking weed just because that's what they like to do, but if there's like some noble cause that's being solved by it, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we can overlook that, right?
And I completely agree with you, Nicole. And I saw that when it like originally, when I started seeing cannabis use pop up in romance novels, it was very much for a purpose. And I think that was a really easy way to kind of start easing people into a trend into that. And now we're getting into more of, instead of a glass of wine, the character smokes a joint on the back porch or on the beach.
you mean it was a gateway drug?
It was a gateway drug.
Nancy Reagan was right.
It
But
was a gateway use of a gateway drug in a book.
Right on.
Like these conversations about like morality and like our need to show something, it's making me reflect on my own writing, because like I have characters who casually use cannabis, it's recreational, they live in Colorado. But I'm like well, they need to be successful. Like I have to show that like smoking a joint doesn't mean that they can't be successful. And like, I mean, there's an entire side conversation about like, bro, have y'all ever had sex high? Like for open door authors, like, come on, we're missing out on beautiful rep there. Um, I think that there's something there, but like I now feel the need to like counteract the like the stoner stereotypes of like sitting and playing Xbox all day. But like, what the hell? There's something wrong with sitting and playing Xbox all day. Like, there are these interesting questions about morality and characters and our need for like these reps to mean something. When like Nicole keeps saying, like, it's just a joint.
And
I
I
agree.
came from the alcohol industry. I worked in the alcohol industry for 10 years. And I've worked for breweries that had very close connections to cannabis culture, both breweries based in Colorado and then a certain brewery based in Georgia whose flagship beer is called 420. So, like, it was such an interesting thing that people, even though there was this definite culture to it, it was still very much shunned upon, but people were allowed to completely go get wasted vomiting in parking lots, and that was okay. So it was just it yeah, working in the alcohol industry, I was like, oh, that's okay, but smoking a joint and sitting on your couch and watching Star Trek all day, that's bad.
Absolutely not. Get out of here with that.
Well,
No, it is. Oh, go
sorry,
ahead, Nellie.
I'll say there's like this like fun historical thought experiment about like if they're both introduced right now, you introduce alcohol and cannabis, there's no way that the one that's legal is alcohol. Like if we're looking at like medical effects and like long-term abuse and the trauma it causes. And I include content warnings, and I include content warnings for alcohol consumption, but a lot of people don't because it's so normed. Um, but like a content warning for cannabis is like drugs. And it's interesting to think about that is, and again, like that is, I'm writing as an American, but like that is like deep baked into our cultural history. And we can't untangle that. Like we're not like existing not in this moment, and not without the legacy of the DEA and Just Say No and all of this kind of like vice squad legislation. And so I think that's also really important because like I'm a very like old school, like everything is political. And I think like the way we write romance
I
is
agree.
political, the way we read and talk about romance is also political. So
Yeah, that's something I speak on a lot because I do agree. We've done a whole panel conversation about how and all of us on the panel agreed that you cannot separate the art from the artist. We did this whole discussion about like how politics plays into that. But I think it's interesting that you brought up sort of like if they were both introduced today, what would the legalities look like for that? Because I actually had an infographic up and I was like, this is too nerdy. I can't bring this to this discussion. That was all about asking both weed users and alcohol drinkers, like about what they would think of as like being the more dangerous drug of choice, what they would think of being, if you could only legalize one, what would it be? And actually they both agreed that they would legalize weed over alcohol, like majority of them, whether they were weed users, non-smokers, or non-weed users, non-drinkers, or alcohol drinkers. They all agreed across the board that they would legalize weed over alcohol, specifically because of like the dangers and the risks associated more with alcohol. So again, it's just with all of that happening, and we're going to dive into a little more with stereotyping. And I did want to share something that I found online about that, but it's just amazing to me how much this conversation changes in the span of a year, in the span of 5 years, because I really do think I've got these 2 blog posts pulled up that I'm going to share some excerpts from, and one of them was published in 2017 and one of them was published at the end of 2020, and just the language between the 2 of them is very different. But before we do that, I did just want to ask 𝐬𝐻𝐢𝐬, I hope I'm getting your name correctly. I did want to share 𝐬𝐻𝐢𝐬's question from the comments as it relates to publishing when it comes to incorporating cannabis use. And that is, do you think trad publishing will embrace romance novels showing characters who do cannabis? Black indies, I read, it's no big deal. And I will say just across like indie romance in general, I think it's definitely less of a big deal as it is with trad pub. But trad pub seems like pearl clutching central.
I think it's the backdooring, right? So the positing it as, you know, a medical remedy, right? Like it's gonna be incremental. I think that it's gonna depend on more states actually legalizing it, and for it to become more of a societal, like accepted norm, for anybody in the big 5 to even take it past more than the medical part. Personally, I don't see them as being that progressive.
Yeah, I was just say like I'm an indie author for a reason. But like if any of the big 5 want to give me money, happy. And I think that my cynical self goes, well, if they realize there's a market, then we're not going to see it. Because all of a sudden, like, you know, a few years ago, I feel like trad realized like, oh my God, lesbians read romance. And so like we saw this like wave of trad sapphic because there was a market. And that's me being very cynical. But I think once they realize like a proof of concept, and of course that's going to come from, I think, indies, because I think a lot of like the groundbreaking own voices work, normative stuff comes out of that world because we take chances. I think that's going to then, once they see like there's proof of concept. But I also think trad, I mean, we're seeing this with children's books, like with this rise of like this conservative policing in states around like LGBT rights and trans rights. The publishers are self-censoring because they're afraid. And I worry that we'll also see that if we see a swing about weed. But I also think, you know, people realize there's money to be made off of weed and cannabis legalization via taxes. So I'm not sure where that's going to go politically, but I think is there a market, and do they see that they can make money off it? Because at the end of the day, this is a business.
And I will say, I know we're not quite at like the book recommendations part of this discussion, but I will say of the romances that at least I can think of, the ones that I like have a list of that do include weed use, one is traditionally published, and it's a smaller press on top of that, but it's Partner Track by Kat Wynn. I think that one was trad pub. And so I really enjoyed that one, but I also do think it's interesting, and this will tie into our discussion about stereotypes, that the main person using weed in that book is the female main character. And I think this is where, and I'm glad 𝐬𝐤𝒐 brought this up in the comments as well. I think this is where intersectionality comes into play as well, because I think not only do we see female characters demonized for this a lot more than we do male characters in our books, but I think when it comes to BIPOC characters, it's presented in a very different way. Not so much by Own Voices authors, because I do think when it's coming from Own Voices authors, they're presenting it in a much more authentic way. But I do think there's a nasty habit of demonizing BIPOC characters and making it out to be something much more in line with a lot of the stereotypes that we've seen play out the way that the government has decided to tell us what people who smoke pot look like. So I think that's really unfortunate and just such a total disservice.
I really like 𝐬𝐤𝒐's comment here about how we view in white romance these characters, they're stoners, things like that. But then when you get into BIPOC and the characters are using drugs, they're very stigmatized, and it's very evident. When I was going through this and looking at books, because we have such a wonderful panel of indie authors, I tried to go and find more traditionally published books featuring the use, and really only one was written by a BIPOC author, and that and we talked about it earlier, was Chloe Lisa's book, and then trying to find things that it was a lot more negative use towards it, interestingly not towards BIPOC characters and stigmatization. So at least I have that going for me. We just used cannabis, and then white people, when they did it, were lazy and stoners. So at least
just
we have
the
that
language. I mean, it just goes to show like how much of a difference like the words make. Like it's insane. But anybody else want to comment on that?
I mean, like I just keep thinking like these, like, I mean, I'm a big fan of like how like binaries are damaging to all of us. And the idea of like, I think we see like, like slut versus like himbo, right? Like we've got these types of things that happen, and you've got druggy versus stoner, and like you say both of those, and because of our cultural norms, you've got a picture in your head of what it means. And I think also as our jobs as authors is to play with that and toy and flip things. And how can we do that in a way that is also like existing within the realities of it? Because I also don't want to like write in a world that pretends that everything is great and that people aren't in jail for cannabis use, and then there's not this history, because I think that's also a fiction in a bad way too. So I think it's an interesting line to walk. And just reps are important, and like just that's I think we come back to every single time.
Okay. I'm going to, this might bring up, I do want to bring up a couple of these things that I read. I know I mentioned these blog posts, but this first one was published in July of 2015. And the headline is, "Romance Writers, is marijuana a big no-no?" And this is in a public forum on a site I've never heard of. And the top responses are, "I'm not touching this one with a 10-foot bong or pole." Okay, like points for humor, but still. Let's see. This person said, "Is this the heroin? People are way less forgiving of the heroines for stuff. Maybe you could swing it if the overall story is gritty or edgy, and the heroine doesn't."
The heroin, like the drug.
Oh.
I was like, I don't see positive heroin use.
I was like, there's positive heroin. Hold on.
Maybe
Regency romance novels. That's positive heroin use, but
positive opium abuse. It's all good.
It's the way that we all were like.
Is this the FMC? Let's go with that. Is this the FMC? People are way less forgiving of FMCs for stuff, but maybe you could swing it if the overall story is gritty or edgy, and the FMC doesn't act really stupid or annoying or something while high. Great. This person
Oh,
said,
that's
I would
lovely.
imagine that there's not a ton of overlap between romance readers and marijuana smokers. Lol.
Okay, Jan.
Yeah.
Sure, Jen.
This
Sure.
this one is
Sure.
actually probably my favorite just because of how ridiculous it is. Well, I'm going to say this in the tone that I think this person typed it in. Well, her friend could do it, and she might be okay with being in the vicinity of the tokers and smokers. But weed use is a Chekhov's gun that symbolizes our lovely lass going off the rails into a fully fledged junkie.
We did discuss
Okay,
how
now
this
I'm
was a
writing
gateway.
Reefer Madness.
Yeah.
I need to write a Reefer Madness romance. Like 1930s. I want this so badly.
Yeah. Well, the heroine just takes a hit and dances around. It's no big deal. But now she has to do something else to get that effect of feeling everything while dancing. What the fuck does that? I don't even know what that means. Like, it's just, it seems like,
Yeah,
at
Footloose
least keep in
situation
mind,
going on.
this was almost 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago that this discussion was happening. Now cut to a Reddit thread, finally a site I understand, from 2 years ago. And the question alone is a much better question, which is, what do you want to see regarding weed in romance books? I'm still surprised that there's hardly any pot users or even downright stoner leads in romance books. I live in a legal state and I'm like, come on, give me a baker heroine or a nervous hero who uses a vape pen to calm down. Do you want irresponsible stoners that straighten up, sexy times while high on edibles, people puffing on joints or a vape like it's no big deal? I want to hear what people want to see. And I do love the way that they phrase that question to start with, because it's obviously like encouraging the conversation of how they want to see more cannabis use in romance. And some people did point out, I think, some stereotypes that we've already touched on, which is that they've read books where weed is mentioned, but it's always the hero using. Like Julia said, they mention different tropes and subtropes within romance where we tend to see more normalized use of marijuana, including MC romance, biker romance, and college new adult romance. So it's a very different tone being had today, and in this case 2 years ago, as opposed to this time 8 years ago, which I think is a good sign that things are heading in direction of things that we would like to see. Yeah, I do. I love Uzu's comment. That's all these baker romance and no one is making an edible baker's enemies to lovers. And I will say, it's
I got a
actually,
rec
I
for
have,
that, actually.
say that again.
I said I have a rec for that, actually. I got to look it up, though, to get the right
Fantastic.
name.
Because this is actually part of one of my work in progresses as well, is that I am working on a farmer's market romance where one of them is a cannabis baker. So it's, I think we're getting there. But yeah, I agree. Anyway, any thoughts on any of those posts?
It's so weird, but also like when I like came out with I like have a short mention of cannabis use in my first book, and then my epilogue is the two MCs getting high and having sex because that's a cool thing to do. And like people came out of the woodwork like, you smoke? Like I feel like everyone's just like waiting for the bat signal, and then they know like, oh, you're cool. Like because we're so worried about the stigma, but when you find out that like someone else smokes and reads romance, or like, you know, has a rep in their book, you're like, all right, I can be cool with you, because I mean, once you're out there saying it, you can't unsay it. And I think that's also that you worry about, like, I mean, Kelly, I don't know if you have the same with your book, you worry about being like, oh, I'm like, you know, weed in my book. And it's like, well, yeah, it's fine. And I also think it's interesting, I see a lot more use of edibles versus like smoking, and the way that even different types of consumption of cannabis And I feel like edibles
Yeah.
are like, as we're talking about like this like creep to norming, edibles are like the step before a vape pen, before a joint. Like we've got, and then like I've never seen a bong in a romance in my life. So when we get those, then maybe we'll win.
I don't know if I have either, unless it was mentioned like in passing of like at a party or something. Like they're at a party in a romance and like there happens to be like somebody doing bong hits, but like it's not the main character.
I've
So
had every form, so you can find
It's like nobody
bongs, you
said
can find
actually.
edibles.
well, you know what's funny about I wanted to bring it up because I know, Nellie, you mentioned like your characters getting high and having sex. And I do think it's interesting because in one of Julia's books, which I think might have actually been my first book that I read of Julia's, Built to Fall, that's actually one of the reasons they don't have sex is because she's had maybe she's a little too high. And he basically tells her like, hey, I don't feel comfortable like us doing that, which I do think it's interesting to have like, you know, just to see like how it's being used and also like the effects that it has on different characters, like, because we know that drugs affect all of us differently. And so to see how that plays out in the romance itself.
And that was her first time using, so he, and that would have been their first time together. So he was like, our first time is not going to be with you high for the first time. It was the next morning.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I do want to point out
Morning.
like my characters smoked together with the like that was their like it was like planned, it was consensual. I'm big on consent.
Yeah.
But I also have a character in my second book who she's got significant anxiety, and she mentioned like, oh yeah, I don't smoke because it like really triggers my anxiety, but her best friend smokes all the time. And so like the idea that like these people can coexist, you're not just like in this like hazy basement in that 70s show constantly. It's just like this like fluid. Some people do, some people don't, and it's cool because like people in their 30s, man, no one's like pushing you to drink, no one's pushing you to like, no one's like pushing you, they're just like existing.
Yeah, and I will say, I know I already threw this comment up on the screen, but this is a romance podcast, but I would read the shit out of a cozy mystery with some pot. Like that's, people know like who follow me that I love romance and I love like mystery thrillers. In fact, I'm co-hosting the Cozy Mystery Book Club next week on YouTube if people want to come talk about cozy mysteries that don't have weed in them, sadly. So yeah, I think the cozy mystery genre could also use a makeover with some more adult themes and topics as well.
I want to see like a cozy mystery featuring like some older, like grandma type women, and they're all like knitting, solving murder mysteries, and having edibles, passing a bong around. I want to see that. That's what I want.
Yes.
Like I want that.
I want the stoned realization when you have that like idea and it solves the mystery.
Yeah.
Like that's what I want, where they're like, oh damn, I didn't put it together. And then they're like, but I'm in this couch, so I have to wait till tomorrow to solve it. So I'll get there. And then like they write down like the random note that the next morning you're like, the fuck did I? Oh, okay, cool. I'm gonna like figure this out. Or like the voice memo you leave yourself that makes no sense.
No. And then they try to do the whole like classic Agatha Christie where they put them in a room and they go through the motives, but they keep like forgetting. And they were like, wait, where was I? And then, yes.
Which, by the way, I've totally seen that play out where a character is drunk, not in a book, but in like a TV show where they're solving the mystery and doing the full recap while they're like drunk off their ass. I'm like, why can't it be a bong? Why can't they be recapping? Or maybe they need it to, like you said, solve the mystery. So it's like they don't know what they're doing until they have that hit. And then all of a sudden they're the most personable, eloquent detective ever. There's just, the possibilities are endless and just sadly untapped.
The last main character in my novella that just came out stumbled upon his career after he took a giant bong rip and was like, weather is cool, I'm going to be a meteorologist. And I'm like, not everything needs to be deep, like sometimes things are just cool and like it's fun, and like who doesn't want that? Like who doesn't have that kind of be like, yeah, neat fish. And then you just like watch videos of aquariums. It's great.
Well, authors, you've clearly you've been summoned by the people in the comments. Like they want more stoner mysteries. They want more stoners in general in their books. Like, I mean, we need it. So and that kind of brings me to my question about your use of cannabis in your books. And so for the authors on the panel, how have you incorporated it into your books? I know we've talked about this a little bit, but maybe in ways that kind of stray from the stereotypes. And then I guess the follow-up to that would be, how have your readers responded to the use of cannabis in your books?
So for me, it's just casual usage. Like somebody will come home from a hard day at work and be like, you know what? Let me go into my little box of trinkets and roll me a joint and smoke one. I had a character who would make her own edibles, and so she had a special cookie jar in her kitchen that said, you know, these are Selena's treats, with treats spelled TREETS. So anybody who saw it, you was like, okay, I know what that's for. But I haven't heard anything positive nor negative from readers about my incorporating cannabis into any stories. Um, I don't know if it's just because like it's just a quick slide in or a quick mention, because I haven't had any like really in depth like long drawn out scenes about um why or when someone is smoking. So maybe that has to do with the lack of feedback. But yeah, I'd be curious to know my answers to this question after I write a series that I'm thinking about with a family who it's going to be like church mouse, city mouse. So one side of the family is the farmers, and they're going to be the ones who actually grow the weed, and then the other side of the family runs the dispensaries in the city. And so
Oh my God, I'm so excited about that already. I don't know where you're at with that writing, like where the progress is, but like I'm very excited about that.
yeah, it's been brewing and ruminating for a while, and hopefully, God willing, and the creek don't rise. One of those books will come out this year.
That would be amazing. I love that. I'm excited for that for you.
So like I said, my first book as a teacher main character, and she drinks and mentions that she smokes weed, and that has not gone over well with a lot of early reviewers. But then I have like actual teachers who are like, "Thank you for like making us humans." So that's a fun dichotomy, because there's definitely still like a morality police around educators as main characters, which is a big part of why I wrote that book. And then it's kind of just like mentioned in passing in my second book, but my work in progress that is is coming is she's loves weed, and she's like, I don't like drinking, it makes me feel like shit, I don't like hangovers, I'd rather just like smoke a joint. And her love interest is a bar owner, and so like they're constantly like kind of having conversations about like, this is culturally normed. I'm gonna go outside and smoke. Is that cool? I'll come back in and like have a seltzer water. At the same time, we're introducing a sober love interest for another character, and so like I feel like also just the more I become aware of it in the world, just like in my own activism,
Yeah.
I'm like it's coming into my books. And then like I said, I wrote just like a stoner himbo in my last novella. I was like, well, why not? Like that's charming. He lives in Northern California. Like it happens. And it's I don't know. It's interesting to see. I think the more I realize it's not there, the more I'm like, I'm putting this in my book. And like, like Nicole said, like we're like bringing it up more and more in our writing. And so I think they're all just really interesting things to investigate. But again, like it feels weird to not mention it as someone in their 30s. And like,
Yeah.
I mean, like I feel like I've read restaurant romance and people are doing lines, and that's normed. But I'm like, but still like. Sorry, I did a lot of years in the service industry too.
No, I'm
That's
so
somebody
with you.
from
And
the-
honestly, that show that came out, what was that? Was it The Bear? The show
Bear.
about like where I was like, this is the most accurate portrayal of the restaurant industry I've ever seen. Like they're drinking things out of like plastic
when
prep
she goes
containers
in the deep freeze. I'm like, been there,
Yep.
girl.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see like what gets okay. But I still like, and this like stigma around characters who smoke is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's there.
Julia, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, but I wanted to rudely insert myself into this conversation and say, I think what I would like to see more of, really, I'm jumping ahead because this is my next question for everybody, but I think what's missing that I want to see more of, and the way to like normalize really any topic in books is to not make a big fucking deal out of it. For it to just be, oh, we're at a party, we're hanging out, and everybody's passing a joint around. And are we talking about the joint? Are we talking about the effects that marijuana has had on our lives? Are we talking about how we got to this point that we needed a joint? No, I mean, we talk about the same thing when it comes to normalizing concepts across, a variety of topics in not just romance novels, but really any kind of media. That if you're not calling attention to something and saying, every little thing about what came before this, where it's going next, how we got to here, and just letting it be and letting the characters live in the moment and do this thing or experience this thing, it will become normalized for the people who are reading it, because you're not making this big to do, this big fuss about how they no longer smoke because of this whatever it can just be that they're smoking after a hard day's work, like they're at somebody's house and they talk about, oh, let's get high and have sex, like, okay, like, I mean, it does not have to be this huge freaking deal. After what were those called, the like after school specials, like that's not why I come to read romance. So yeah, anyway, but
So
Julia.
you're saying I should not say there's no hope but dope in my notes.
That should be the title, actually, just so you know.
Tagline.
I would read
Tagline.
that. If I read a book called No Hope But Dope, I'd be like, done. Hannah,
Oh,
like,
goodness.
all I want now is just like punny titles about cannabis. Marijuana, her. Like,
Hey. I mean, Nicole's the one writing about the family that is growing and selling. So I mean, I'm thinking you got to get some titles in there that
It's
poke
gonna
fun.
have some punny titles for sure.
I love it. Julia, I'm going to throw it back over to you because the original question was, how have you incorporated it into your books that maybe, goes against some of the stereotypes, and how have your readers responded?
I was gonna say a lot of what you said. It's just like Nicole said, it's casually mentioned. It's morally neutral. Um, I've written a lot of books, so it's in most of them, and it's just not a big deal. It's like having a glass of wine after work. The only time I've had, and I don't read reviews anymore, but when I put out my Hanukkah novella called 8 Cozy Nights, you read that. There was a scene where the main character's sister and brother-in-law, after they put their kids to bed, lit up. And I thought, to me, that's like having a glass of wine after you put your kids to bed. You're tired and you want to mellow out. So, but I read a review that was just scathing that parents would do that. So I think that might be a place in romance, like single parents or parents lighting up, that is not written about at all. I don't know if I'm going to go there, but maybe. And my readers, otherwise, like I asked them about recommendations or how they felt about my books for this topic, and my readers are used to reading my books and somewhat grittier books, and they were like, it's destigmatized. It's not a big deal to us. So they're that type of reader that it's just there and part of the story. And I mean, I feel like I'm that type of reader too. That's why I don't notice it. And so, yeah, like you said, if it's not made a big deal, it's not a huge part of the story, it's just there, then that will destigmatize it.
Yeah, that's great. So funny. Didn't you know that once you become a parent, you can't have any more fun? Like, that's not allowed. You're not. Oh, Jen's got something to add to that.
I have thoughts. Okay, so coming from the alcohol industry, we're just talking about how the overconsumption and things were encouraged as an employee through breweries and stuff like that. Not even touching on that, but I have two kids I have an almost 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. And when I had my first kid, it was really during that boom of the mommy needs wine and like all of the like marketing and all this stuff. It was like mommy juice, wine cups, and like it was so like how to get through parenting, mommy needs alcohol, and all this stuff. But Lord mentioned that you enjoy doing something else, and everybody was jumping all over you about it. And I just like sitting there and seeing coming from the alcohol industry and seeing the detrimental effects on it of overuse and that I had such struggles with that as a parent going into that. I'm like, it was totally okay for me to be like serving up alcohol kegs of beer at my kid's first birthday party, which we did. But Lord have mercy if I would have offered anybody else anything else. So yeah,
I mean,
thoughts.
oh, go ahead, Nicole.
No, I was just gonna say I saw I spend way too much time on TikTok. Um, but I saw this TikTok where it was a toddler. She couldn't have been no more than 3 years old. The dad says, "Oh, daddy needs his juice. Can you go get daddy juice?" She goes and gets him a beer. But then it gets worse. It gets worse. They go, "Oh, mama needs her juice." She goes and gets her mom a high noon. So like she knows the difference between like, but that's normalized, right? But I can't tell a kid to go grab my lighter so I can go walk outside. You know what I mean? Like,
It's
because then it's like, oh, what are you doing?
well,
Like,
and I mean, honestly, just to put it in like another perspective, like even if you remove weed from this situation, think about the terminology we use when it comes to drinking versus reading romance novels. We've got mommy juice, but we've got mommy porn. Very different.
I
Very
was just
different.
about I was also just about to hit on the gendered way that we talk about alcohol in general. And I love to drink too. I like the culture of alcohol. I like the taste and the craft and whatever. But there's also like it was interesting we were talking about earlier. There's a gendered split to how we're seeing even like cannabis use show up. Like I do, like I said, I think women in romance almost want to do edibles. I think guys tend to smoke, and that's also interesting about how we just think about like, and again, like which one is more palatable, and like wine has like a more like, oh, it's fine, or like a seltzer, it's sanitized, yes. Um, and I don't write kids in my romance. I wish all my characters were child free, but unfortunately they have minds of their own. But I think that that's really true. And but like you also have careers where it's unacceptable, right? Like if you were to write a nurse character and she smoked or he smoked, I think they're like, oh, how can you be respectful? But like if they're a businessman or something like that, or they're in the industry, there's just some like really interesting assumptions, and a lot of that is like you cannot take it out without intersectionality about like
Yeah.
a black parent versus a white parent,
Yep.
versus like a Latin parent. Like all of these have different stereotypes that we bring into them, and again, like I said, like I think it's on the back end of like showing the craft of writing books where I like end up talking a lot about this. And then the books, it's like, oh yeah, I have a joint. But I'm like, did you know? And I'm like sharing stats and just like being like an angry human on the internet.
The way that our culture, and like I can only really speak from like the Western world, but like specifically here in the United States, like the way that we try to enforce a binary is just insane, like across things, like when it comes to gender, when it comes to this is what men do, this is what women do, when it comes to race, when it comes to the good versus the bad, when it comes to the rich versus the poor, like we're constantly being told that we need to fit within this binary, and when you do or when you don't, there's something wrong with you, that you're out of place, you're doing something wrong because you're not existing in the way that we've decided you need to. And I do think, and this is why to me all art is political, all art will always be political, because this is coming, what we write is very much a reflection of our experiences, the world we live in, whether you're writing contemporary romance or romance set in the 1800s or in a different world. It's not in a vacuum. Like it's coming, it's very reflective of what we live in. And then on top of that, what we put out there, we see also reflected back to us in our everyday world. It's a cycle. So, I mean, I don't understand when people want to say that, like, oh, you know, it's just the way it is, you know, or like, this isn't coming from the world we live in. It's fiction. It's fiction. That's my favorite phrase I get to hear from people. It's not real. And it very much is. It very much is. The characters on the page might not be real, but I would bet that they come from a place of reality, or at least parts of them do. And you can't ignore that. And if you do, you're willfully ignoring it. Nods. Yep. No, I gotcha.
Amen. Amen. No, like for real, because you know, people will say the characters are not real, right? Sure, but a human created them, right? A human who was coming to them with a certain level of experience that they've imbued into this book that you're reading that makes it
Yeah.
relatable. So, like, don't get me started on that.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I tell everyone I know I'm just trying to take parts of them for characters. Like, I'm just
Yeah.
Oh,
snacking
yeah.
and pulling and
I
picking.
mind people's lives
Like,
all the time.
sorry, everyone knows in my life, like, you're fair game. Sorry about it.
Don't tell
Well,
me
and I
nothing
like
if you don't want to
that
show
you
up in the
say, yeah. Well, and Nellie, you say like, I write books about like elder millennials, which I mean, it is something that like, at least when I published my novella last year, I said something very similar where I was just like, I'm writing about people who are very much, you know, part of my life, that this looks like the world that I existed and the people that I know. And I do think it's interesting when you get a review then that'll be like, this book was too buzzy, or like this book was like, my favorite was I got the phrase aggressively millennial, or overtly feminist, and I was like, fantastic. Mwah. Glad you
Thank
got the
you.
point.
I did
Like,
it.
it's so funny that it's like people want to label reality in a certain way, and I recognize like we all live in different lens, and like things affect us differently, and we, you know, whether you're brought up in rural Georgia or like the streets of San Francisco, like obviously that's going to affect the perspective that you have on the world. But that's one of the things I like about books and movies and TV shows, is being able to put those different perspectives into those and then watch them and see what this looks like from somebody else's point of view. And I assumed that's what everybody thought, but apparently not so much. Now I know I've already kind of talked about what I'd like to see more of when it comes to like future romance novels regarding weed use, but was there anything else anybody wanted to add to that?
I think again, just the casual. There's no cause. There's no reason. We see so much casual use of alcohol. People don't justify it, and just moving past that. Maybe staying away from the casual heroin use, though. That's still a bridge we're not ready to cross.
Yeah. Different panel. Well, tune back in a year from now. I don't know. We'll see what we're talking about then. But I'm with you. Like, I think the normalizing, the discussions, the usage, and seeing it. I like your idea of like seeing parents who are smoking a little bit more. I think that would be great. Like, the more we see it, the more we will become accustomed to it not being out of the everyday.
And two, I'm not opposed to seeing more education about it, not in the very special episode of Family Matters type way, but like, you know, if you do have a character that's talking about, you know, they're a recent, you know, smoker and they just started it, but, you know, they're doing it for their anxiety, right? So then, not just I'm doing this for my anxiety, like talk in specific, like, well, you know, this strain, these terpenes, like that type stuff, like put that in there too, right? Because like the science behind, maybe it's just me and I'm a nerd, but like the science behind the effects of, you know, the many different combinations of THC, and I'm just like, oh, okay, that's what they do. Like it's me on Leafly reading strain effects because I just want to know.
It's me obsessed with anything from Girl Scout cookie. It's like I love it.
Ooh, yeah.
But that's true, because that's a great point, Nicole. Because I feel like people are like, and I had a joint. I'm like, that's like going into a bar and being like, I ordered a beer. Like, do you know, like we all make those like old timey jokes that go in. They're just like a beer. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
there's 20. and like I have a joke cracked and like about indica and sativa in my book, and like just little things like that, like again normalizes like the nuance of it.
Yeah.
I used to joke that it was really hard to take things seriously as a medical treatment that were called like Cushy Punch 420 69 Dougie Doug, and I was like, it's hard to be like, I'll take my Xanax and my that. Like the words we use.
No, I
Like,
feel
even
like
if-
when the people go in, they try to order a beer at the bar, they get all these beer names, and they're like, I just want a beer.
I just want a Miller High Life, guys. That's my
Just want
favorite
Miller
beer.
Lite Life.
That's so funny. No, but I think that's a great thing that both you and Nicole mentioned is like to see like the different ways that it is used and the different like forms that it comes in as well.
And I think it's interesting, and like we've definitely seen this as an intentional move on the part of like advocates for legalization, moving from like marijuana and weed to cannabis is a very intentional language shift. And you see it in a lot of different like advocacy. And just that because we do have these stereotypes of like jazz cigarettes and reefer madness, and so to kind of like remake them, and like yes, it's definitely like a gentrification of weed for sure. And so like honoring that, but how can we make it like palatable for people who have, you know, my mother-in-law who thinks that if she takes a joint, she'll like take a hit of a joint, she'll jump off a building. Like, no, you're just gonna like, eat a bag of Cheetos. Calm down.
I will say, one of my very good friends has like chronic pelvic pain, and like she talks about it very publicly. She's done a one-woman show about it, but she explored using CBD, like coconut oil that you know, put up in there, and accidentally did get the kind that had THC in it, and made for a very interesting experience that we talked about. And I'm like,
can she send a link?
Yeah, we'll do. I'll hook you up. But there you go. One more thing that I was
I'm just trying to do some research, just for future research.
Yeah, just you know,
it's for lived experience writing. Like it's for the character.
In case. Yeah. I'll ask for a link. But last thing I just did want to have everybody weigh in on was if you have book recommendations featuring, you know, weed use that you wanted to share with people, and feel free to plug your own books as well.
For sure. So earlier somebody mentioned edible maker, enemies to lovers. So both main characters in this are not bakers, but one is, but it's an enemies to lovers story. It's called Claimed by Crayson by Sherelle Green. It is, the epilogue alone is worth the read, because the epilogue involves 4 of the friends that you'll meet along the way. In the book, all getting high off edibles, and I read it, but then I also listened to it in the audiobook. I would recommend listening to it in the audiobook for that epilogue alone, because I called Sherelle and like was screaming on the phone laughing. Like, this is the funniest thing that I've ever witnessed, experienced, because she captured like just how goofy you can really be off an edible, like perfectly. And each of the 4 different people like reacted to the edible in different ways. Great. And then for all of the self-promotionary purposes, I have 3 books that mention cannabis in some way. First, it's called Smitten. That's book 2 in my Accidentally in Love series. That's the one I told y'all about. She's the home baker who makes her own edibles. And then in my book Hunger, the female main character actually works for a dispensary called Puff. And then it's funny because I think Jen mentioned reading a book by someone called Thank You Next earlier that has cannabis in it. I have a novelette that I wrote called Thank You Next. And how the 2 main characters actually come back into contact with one another is my female main character is like creeping out of her family's house around the holiday time to go have a smoke in the woods, and she runs into her childhood friend. So those are my
love
suggestions.
that. That sounds like so much fun. Well, and I will say, just in case people didn't realize, I do take these Tit Talk panels and I release them as podcast episodes. So any of the books that are being recommended, I will 100% make sure to put in the show notes for the podcast episodes. So if you're listening now, or if you're watching this live and you want to come back and see a full list of book recommendations, that will be available to you when the podcast episode comes out. So that's all I wanted to add. Whoever's next, feel free to add your book recs.
So I've been bumping super hard on my own reading recently, but Katie Casey, they write queer baseball romance, which is wonderful. And their most recent publication, which made me sob and care about fictional baseball more than I've cared about real baseball ever, is it's called Diamond Ring, and has a character who just like, casually uses it. Wild Pitch, which is another wonderful femme-dom baseball romance, which we never see. Both by leads. There's like, just casual, and it's like in the air by Kat Geraldo was really wonderful. Also great discussion of kink in that book. And then Chloe Leese uses it, but it's definitely through medical. Her most recent character, Sebastian, uses it for some chronic pain medication. And there's a scene where he is just in a robe smoking a joint, and I think it's the hottest thing I've ever thought about in my life.
That's like one of those it's really sexual without being sex scene.
Yeah, like, and
moments.
it's just like he had like a joint like hanging from his lip, and I was like, excuse me, I gotta go take a break
Hot.
from reading. And then for self-promotion, my first book is called Needs More Time. It's about a burned out teacher and a camp director, and their epilogue is just stoned horniness on my website. And then I have a novella that just came out on 4/20, because he's a stoner. And it's an enemies to lovers storm chasing novella. And then my book coming out this summer called Educated. She is she's neurodiverse and definitely has a whole monologue, which I definitely wrote from my own experience, about how like sometimes when you've got too many thoughts in your head, just smoking can have you process them one at a time. And so it's like, thought one, maybe this isn't as bad as thought two. And so that's kind of in the world in that one. So that's
and congrats on the new release. I will say I've never read a storm chasing romance before. So when I haven't read it yet, but I downloaded your book and was like, yay, this will be new.
just getting nerdy settings and getting people to buy them is like
all
I want to do.
Twister and inspiration at all in this? I need to know there's a correlation of Twister.
It's like, did you watch Twister and want more
horniness?
And also
I'm here for it. I'm here for it 100%.
And there's also like, I wanted to write a girly girl and a burly boy and a mama, because we love a nice hillbilly rap. So it's fun.
Jen or Julia, book recs? Julia's unmuted.
Well, just this week, I don't know. I just happened to read one it was an 𝐬𝒡𝒆𝒅. I don't know if you guys have read 𝐬𝒡𝒆𝒅s, but it's called Lavender Moon by Sarah Blue, and it was just a low angst, adorable little story, and they lit up, and I was like, wow, perfect timing to talk about.
I love that worked out that way. And what's funny is like, I know 𝐬𝒡𝒆𝒅 isn't necessarily like set in a different world sometimes, but not always. But I never really think about weed use like beyond our reality. And so that is interesting though to think about. And I don't think I've read it to see it in like fantasy representation or paranormal. Doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah.
I don't think I've read it.
I think Cleo
𝐬𝒡𝒆𝒅 is kind of like cusp.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think Cleo Evans, who writes Monster Smut, has it in her book, so I could be wrong.
Okay. Well, and as Julia mentioned, a good amount of her books feature it as well. My favorite that I do still recommend people is Built to Fall. So I think that's a great one to start with, and it's a standalone. I think I know you meet characters in it that go on to have their own books, but I do think it's a great one to start with.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jen?
So it's another Chloe Leese book, Always Only You. This book was fabulous. I just finished it. It was so great. The main character has rheumatoid arthritis, so she uses medical marijuana, but also uses it because she enjoys using it. And the male main character, like he's so cute because he's like this 25-year-old virgin and they use weed together. He like it was adorable. I really liked it. It was my first Chloe Lee's book and I enjoyed it so much. And then there's How to Fake It in Hollywood by 𝐬𝒂𝐢𝐬. Has marijuana use in it. And then I'm, like I said, because we have such a fabulous panel of indie authors, I wanted to see what I could find in like Trade Pub, and there wasn't really that much, and so I was like, oh, okay. And then but yeah, so those would be like my two, and then of course the Georgie All the Way by Kate Claiborne and Thank You Next by Andy J. Christopher had we use in them, and they were fabulous books. So those would be my recommendations.
Yeah, and I know I mentioned a few already, but I did see somebody bring it up in the comments earlier on that Jessica Peterson has a couple, and she has one in particular that I love. I think it's Southern Bombshell. Let me double check. Yeah, Southern Bombshell, and it's in the very first scene of the book, and it's both characters who like to smoke, but the very first scene of the book is that he welcomes her home like with her slippers and pajamas and dinner and a pipe ready for her. And I was just like, this is romance. These are the grand gestures that I'm looking for in romance.
That is a man written by a woman right there.
What
Right there,
an
right?
incredible way to start a book. And it starts with them together. It's kind of like we're secretly hooking up and then we have to break up and then we like get back together later on kind of book. But I love that. And then it wasn't until somebody reminded me that I forgot. It's a Reese Ryan book, I think. Oh yeah, it's in Waking Up Married by Reese Ryan. They eat some weed brownies that they don't know are weed brownies and they wake up married. So I thought that was kind of like a fun spin on what we would normally see as like a we're drunk in Vegas kind of story. So again, just sort of like substituting in weed instead of alcohol. So a fun play on that. But and then obviously I did recommend Built to Fall, and I mentioned Partner Track earlier on, and I enjoy that one because there's a lot that's uncommon about the female character in that book that I just will always recommend. She's older, she's very independent, she lives on her own, she smokes for fun, and it's great. So yeah, I want more. I want more of them.
Kelly, doesn't your novella also have casual cannabis?
Mine does. Thanks for promoting me. No, mine does. It's very minor. It's very casual. They're at a party and people are passing it around, and I did exactly what I want to see in romance. I didn't make a big deal out of it. It was just them enjoying a party. And as Nellie said, they're in their 30s. And that's just what a lot of times you do at parties.
Honestly, and like we talked about what we want to see. I'm honestly surprised we haven't seen more like psychedelics and microdosing.
Yeah. Where are the mushrooms? What's
where are and like this? I can't take. I'm on way too many SSRIs for that. But like, I don't know. I feel like that's also in the world. But like, I don't know. Yeah. We gotta get people to realize that like, dick doesn't cure anxiety first. So there's steps.
Can you put that?
You mean my husband has been lying to me for all these years?
I need that on a mug. Like,
I honestly, because like, how many were we like at the end? It's like the same thing. Like, and then she doesn't smoke, and she went off her meds, and I was like, I would be intolerable.
I think this is you've just unlocked like a new idea for merch that's like dick doesn't cure, and then like list the things after that.
Is it ЛEXapro? Dick isn't Paxil.
This is a collaboration I'm on board with. We're gonna have to talk about this
offline.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, I think that just about does it for us. Thanks to everybody. I know we actually went a little bit longer than anticipated, so I'm glad. But this is great. I there's nothing that I would cut out of this. I think this is all wonderful things to talk about as it relates to the topic. So last thing, if everybody could just kind of tell people where folks can find and follow you. And again, I will include links for all of these things in the show notes for the podcast. But for everybody watching now, how can they find you? in a non-creepy way?
Since I'm the only non-author on this panel, I'm at Brazen Book Babe on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. I have very sporadic content because I have ADHD. So I talk about reading, I talk about parenting, I talk about ADHD. It's just all over the place, and I don't update it. But I would love a follow, and I love following people back. So that's where I am as the only I don't need to promote myself person.
Oh, of course you should. No, absolutely. Well, and it's always important to me. I know this panel has more authors than I'd say my usual panels do, but it is important to me to include both like readers and authors amongst these panel discussions. So I'm glad that you were here with us, Jen. Who else? Oh, I think we lost Nicole's audio, maybe.
Nope, I was just dumb and muted. Sorry.
Oh, okay. There we go.
I lost my AirPods. So you can find me everywhere. Well, that's a lie. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as _ Nicole Falls. Those are probably the places I am most often. I'm on Facebook, but like I'm not on Facebook. And I just be watching TikToks. I'm I don't be doing the dances and all that. But yeah, Twitter, Instagram, _ Nicole Falls.
Nice. Okay, and over to Nellie.
You can find me on Instagram way too often, especially when I work from home, at 𝐬𝐤𝐿𝐸_writes, WOAH. I have a TikTok under the same name, and about once every 2 weeks, I impulsively decide to make a TikTok and then get terrified of the app because it really scares me. So I'm mostly on Instagram, and all my books are on KU. So
awesome. And then Julia.
I am everywhere, too many places, and it's just author Julia Wolf, and all my books are in Kindle Unlimited on Amazon.
Woohoo! And I'm Kelly, and I'm at Boobies Podcast, pretty much most places. I also have a personal author account at author Kelly Ray, but I don't use it nearly enough. So if you're looking for me, find me at the Boobies. That's where I'll be. But yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you to my amazing panelists. And if you're listening to the podcast at home, thanks for tuning in. I'll be sure to include links for all of the books and places mentioned today. And we'll see you next month for a new Tit Talk and a new panel. So thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye.
thanks, Al.